Hello and welcome to this module, Learner Development and Characteristics in the Classroom. This is part of the Inclusive Education Paraprofessional Training Series. To start, our objectives are 1, to understand the concepts of strengths and needs-based approaches to supporting students, and 2, to identify common approaches to supporting students with disabilities in classrooms. So we'll start off with some definitions and examples of what it means to take a strengths and needs-based approach to supporting students. And then we'll get into some of the common characteristics that you may see in terms of the needs that students have. And we'll talk about some ways that we can respond to those needs to support students. So let's start off by talking about strengths and needs-based approaches. First, we may commonly see approaches to describing students that are not strengths-based, that take more of a deficit-based approach. For example, we may often see language that focuses on what the child cannot do. We may see language describing them in their individualized education plan, such as that they can't do something, they function at a low level, they're unable to do something, or they struggle with something. Oftentimes, we make comparisons between students with disabilities and students without disabilities as a way to describe the deficit that a student with a disability has. And when we do this, oftentimes we may not address the environment or the role of supports in what a student could be able to do. So this sort of paints a limited picture of a student and often a very negative image of a student. Let's look at an example here on the right-hand side. This is describing Franklin. And as we can see, Franklin struggles with comprehending and recalling. And later on, it says Franklin is unable to recall information. So we can see some of that deficit language where we're describing Franklin in pretty absolute terms, that Franklin struggles and he's not able to do something. But let's think about another way that we could describe Franklin that's going to paint a more accurate and more complete picture. And that would be taking a strengths-based approach. When we do that, we tend to focus more on what the individual can do or what they're working towards. Students oftentimes are not really in this, they completely do something or they can't do it at all, but they're always making progress in different areas. So we want to describe what they're working towards. We also want to acknowledge the supports that we're using in order to allow the student to demonstrate their best abilities. What tools are they using? What about the environment helps them work best? That can paint a more complete picture. So we might see language like the child requires such and such support in order to demonstrate a skill. They're good at something, they prefer this aspect of an environment in order to work best. They do best when, something like that. So let's look at an example on the right-hand side. Here, when we describe Franklin, we said that he has difficulty recalling information, but then later it says, for example, when prompted by saying, and then later it describes that Franklin often guesses and it's unclear if he comprehended. So here now we're giving an example and then describing what the student does do. Well, the student guesses in order to explain what he comprehends. And we say that it's unclear that he comprehended, right? So it's giving more information than just saying that the student is unable to comprehend. We're actually looking at what the student can do and giving more information. Later on, it describes tools or support. When Franklin is given a graphic organizer, when Franklin has access to a peer buddy, we're describing supports. When these supports are paired with a text of his choice, so when he has a preference that we acknowledge, he is able to demonstrate that skill maybe partially or more completely. So here, compared with the last slide, we're describing Franklin in a way that acknowledges when we give the supports to the student, when we change the environment, it allows the student to be able to demonstrate what they are good at and how they work best. This is important for a paraeducator because you may be working with students where from your work with them, from observing them, you'll be well positioned to be able to see, okay, when a student gets this support, say a graphic organizer, I notice that they're able to work differently or to work more effectively than without that support. So you'll be a good resource to be able to keep track of that so we can get a better picture of the student's strengths. It's also important to consider a needs-based approach when we are supporting students. And what this means essentially is that we focus not on the disability labels itself, but we think about what are the needs of the student in that specific context. And that may change from one classroom to another. A student may have different academic or behavioral needs than they do in a different class. What are the kinds of supports that we can be provided to address these needs? How can the environment be adapted to better suit the student? And ultimately, if we think about needs, then it provides a more universal approach. And we're not just separating out students with and without disabilities, but in a more inclusive way, we're thinking all students have needs. If we start with needs, then we can work our way to figuring out the ways that we can support those needs and get the best that we can out of students. Let's get in now to some common characteristics and supports for students in the classroom. These are some areas that you might see students have difficulties with, and also some ways that you can help them in the classroom. So let's talk first about some key academic areas like literacy and math. So common characteristics that you may see are difficulties with reading comprehension or fluency, which is the speed and accuracy with which students read. Also things like mathematical computation, written expression, memory. There's a lot of different aspects that come together, with literacy being also a key part of mathematics, especially when it comes to things like word problems. So when we think about examples of supports in areas like literacy and math, I'll highlight a couple things here. Students may benefit from options for representing information. This may be having access to audiobooks or e-text, text-to-speech tool, so that they're able to take in information via different modalities. Graphic organizers can be particularly beneficial for students, especially if that allows them to break down, say, their understanding of a story and divide the information of what they comprehended into different sections of a graphic organizer. It can also help, especially with mathematics, when we break down problems into steps, especially using a structure or organizer that allows students to take things one step at a time. And then also peer-assisted learning strategies, or PALS, is where we group students or pair students in a way that provides them different roles so that they can support each other, capitalizing on their different strengths. Getting into receptive and expressive communication, this may be particularly important for a student who has a communication impairment. Receptive referring to taking in information, expressive meaning to express or to communicate information outwards. So common characteristics we should be aware of are variations in producing or articulating speech. In terms of receptive, it could be challenges in terms of taking in or processing information. So some support we want to consider for students who may have these types of difficulties is augmentative and alternative communication, AAC. That could be something where a student has a device or perhaps is using an iPad with a program, an application that allows them to click on different buttons that will support them to express themselves. We may need to provide more time for interaction and expression. So some students may not be able to verbalize as quickly, or they need to brainstorm ahead of time so that they can participate in a class discussion. So we want to provide them that time or that structure. And we also want to provide visual representations of an information. So we're not just relying only on students taking in speech or what they hear, but also being able to provide visuals to support multiple ways of taking in information. Moving on to behavioral. Behavior really ranges, but we can think about, for example, students with autism, first of all, that may have certain characteristics such as preference for daily routines or self-stimulating behavior. These students may deviate from what's expected in terms of behavior at schools, and that could be a challenge for them. It could be a challenge for their classmates. And so some ways that we can support these students are by establishing predictable routines and schedules, monitoring and establishing behavioral goals. And sometimes that even involves collecting data. Did the student meet the goal, meet their behavioral goals for what they were doing at the beginning of class, during class, at the end of class? And we want to keep track of that on a daily basis. That may often be the case. We also want to consider reducing the effects of stimuli. Is there light or sound or touching or different aspects of the environment that could be distracting or adjusted so that they could be actually supportive of the student's behavior? Other aspects of behavior, this may be common for students who have emotional regulation impairment, could be expressing frustration or anxiety, aggression, refusal to do work, being withdrawn, or self-injurious behavior, which could affect themselves or even their peers. So in this case, it's important to consider verbal and visual behavioral prompts. So when we prompt students, either by showing them something or speaking to them, that just reminds them, hey, this is the phrase or the image that reminds you to get back on track, to remind you that you're doing this behavior that might not be so positive. We can also instruct peers to be understanding and supportive, to try to model and support that behavior of the student. And also may provide breaks during or between activities. And lastly, teach executive functioning strategies. That might be teaching students how to monitor their own behavior, how to organize and prioritize as they're completing a task so that they can reach their goals. Getting onto sensory needs, this could be related to students having low vision, including blindness or other visual impairments, or a student who's deaf or has other type of hearing impairment. So these students will receive a range of supports. One of them could be orientation to the environment. For example, a student who is blind, we may need to teach them about what physical environment they're entering so that they're able to navigate that on a daily basis. We also may need to provide multiple forms of communication, whether it's presenting information, whether it's audio and visual, large text, or perhaps a student reads Braille. Or a student may have a sign language interpreter, hearing aids, or the teacher may use an FM amplification system where what they're speaking goes either to a speaker in the room that's amplified, or even directly to the student's ear. Physical movement and motor planning is another important one. This could be, for example, a student who has cerebral palsy or another type of disability that may affect their movements, or muscle control, may affect their fine motor skills or gross motor skills, and just their range of movement in general. They also may experience pain that we need to be aware of and try to reduce to make them comfortable. So some examples of supports will be related services such as physical therapy and occupational therapy that they may receive outside of class. They also it may be important to arrange desk and furniture to make sure that they have freedom of movement around the classroom and full access to all the materials that other students have access to. And finally, it's important to become familiar if they have an assistive device or orthopedic or wheelchair that they use, that we do become familiar with how they use it, and so we can support them as needed. Some deeper dive activities. Activity number 3 is the video where you can learn further about the special education categories of disability that I introduced previously. Activity 4 is about supporting students in inclusive classrooms, and it's an article that talks a little bit about some more strategies. Once you've completed all sections of Module 2, make sure to complete the Module 2 check for understanding. All participants must complete each check for understanding prior to moving on to the next module. And here are the references. And thank you for your attention.